Hello and welcome to the No Hair, All Heart podcast. I am your host, Mookie Spitz, and I am the bald, no hair one. And the one with all the heart today is Mr. Kevin Stone. Kevin is fanatical. He is 100% dedicated to everything he does. Years ago, we were colleagues. He was a producer in an agency and he produced the hell out of everything. But when I brought up music, which is a shared passion that we both have, his eyes would light up and the usual 120% would go to 200%. Kevin is fanatical. He is a fanatical fan. A lot of the same music, a lot of the same shows. And I thought we'd bring him on for him to share some of his effervescent passion, talk about music and the music industry, its evolution over the decades, and basically share some of the joy that he experiences, I think, on a daily, if not hourly basis when he listens to some of our favorite bands. Welcome aboard, Kevin.
Well, hello. Glad to be here.
Thanks so much for joining. I remember my first concert experience. It was the Rush Hemispheres tour. I believe it must have been 1979,
That is right.
maybe 1980. It was the
Yeah.
Chicago International Amphitheater. One of my friends had a date. He had a car and he had a date. And I became his backup. For one reason or another, the date didn't show, and he gave Spitz a call. And he's like, "Do you want to go see Rush?" And I was like, "You can actually do that? You can actually see the band that's on my turntable?" He goes, "Come on, dude, I'll pick you up. Let's go." Tickets were, I think, $16.50, if I remember. I should have saved the stub. But anyway, Paul picked me up, drove me in, we parked, and my mind was blown. There was the band, maybe only a few hundred feet away, I think, which was choice for me. Thousands of people screaming. They knew all the words. It was my favorite record from my favorite band, and it was like a religious experience. I'll never forget it. It popped my cherry for live entertainment. And throughout my entire life, that was the pinnacle of any kind of event experience, coupled with the passion and joy of just experiencing music, not only alone in my room, but with thousands of other people on the same wavelength. What was your favorite show? What was your first show, if I could put it that way?
Yeah. Well, I saw Rush on the Hemispheres tour as well. It was 79. Blondie warmed up for him. I saw him in Philadelphia at the old Spectrum. And, the claim to fame of that show is that Blondie got booed off stage and bottles and other paraphernalia were thrown on stage just to get them off. That's how passionate the Rush fans were. But I saw a show before that. My first show was Jethro Tull in '78, and again, just part of that prog rock, that art rock scene that we kind of gravitated toward. I wanted to see Ian Anderson in his prime. I was a kid. I went the first night. Similar story. I went with my cousin. Um, you know, Ended up driving over in a van with like 5 other people in the van. Had my first Heineken ever, and loved it so much. I went back the second night by myself, riding the subway to Philadelphia, and walked to the Spectrum to see show two. So, from a live perspective, totally hooked on live music. But going back to the Rush thing, that was really, that turned me into not only a fan of them, but it evolved into wanting to play an instrument, and that's how impactful their music was, and that that energy that they brought. And back in the day, and I'm sure you'll agree, you felt special if you liked them. It was a time before they became ultra popular. It was a time, it was still in its purity, and that progressive and expressive music was out there, in album format, right? You got that full experience with it, and liking them at that early stage, I actually was turned on to them probably like end of 76, 77. So around 2112, All the World's a Stage. And I was hooked, but I didn't go to any shows. I was a little bit too young. I remember buying a Farewell to Kings when it came out, and I had the chance to go see them, and I just couldn't swing it. It was at the Tower Theater in Philadelphia. I was just too young. My parents wouldn't take me, so I was like stuck. And I was the only person who really, was that passionate about that band. But you felt special. You felt really special because you were kind of in. You were in the fan club, and I actually joined the Rush Backstage Club in 1977. And later in 77, because of A Farewell to Kings, I bought my first bass guitar, a black 4001 Rickenbacker, just like Geddy Lee. So it just all culminated in that musicianship and that artistry that seems to have gone away. And I know we want to kind of discuss those types of things, the evolution of music through the years, but that experience of holding an album and opening it up and looking at the liner notes and the sleeves and the lyrics and everything that came with it was just, it was gold to me as a child. And I've carried it with me, and like you said, I'm passionate about what I do in life, but I notch it up with music because music has never let me down in life, right? Like, you go through ups and downs, and you know so many things through your life, and experiences, school, relationships, marriage, kids, all that type of stuff. Music is the constant that never lets you down.
Yeah, and it's a constant that's never going to go away, including live shows. The musical environment, the industry, everything about music has changed. But people now will pay 10 grand to see Taylor Swift, and we can talk about the good and bad aspects of that. But there's nothing like live music, and there's nothing like music, to your point, which soothes the soul. There's something inchoate, instinctive, raw about the power of music to move people, both for good and for bad. Whether you're the German army marching into Paris or whether you're celebrating We Are the World, it taps into the heart of humans in such a basic, powerful way. And it's fascinating too how you bring up the idea of feeling special. You're part of something. You're part of that energy. And it's an energy that's associated with a band, with a personality, with a persona. So you're kind of combining this primal energy with our love of celebrity, our love of star power. I remember flipping through Rolling Stone magazine back in those early days, must have been around that time, 78, 79. And they had the reviews of the albums of the year. And I remember Rush was covered by Rolling Stone, by Cream magazine. But I remember the albums got 0 stars, half a star,
Yeah.
that Geddy Lee sounded like a chipmunk, that the
Yep.
drums were too busy, that the guitar was pretentious and indulgent. And they were ostracized by the critical community, analogous to how Led Zeppelin in its early days, believe it or not, was trashed by all the tabloids. The singer with overly blonde hair, the endless guitar solo, the lead footed drumming. And now they're iconic. And I think Rush has entered that pantheon as well. And just one example of that feeling of specialness, that feeling of captivating live entertainment. And lastly, to your point, it was a different world back then. And I think a lot of listeners who are younger, the Gen Zers, the millennials, I'm a cusp boomer. I'm 1964, so I am
Yeah.
a few decades young. And I think you're a little younger than me, but we come from that same era, I think, where just like you mentioned, The cycle went like this. You went to the record store and then you flipped through vinyl records. They were 12 inches, right, in diameter, in a paper sleeve that often was folded. You had artwork on the cover. You had liner notes. You often had the lyrics of the songs printed into this experience. You bought a physical object that held the music. It wasn't like you were streaming on your phone. This disembodied song of this endless archive just enters at the tap that you make on a screen. It was a physical product that required a physical process of going to a physical store. And then you'd put it on a turntable, and a needle would literally run across the surface of the scratched vinyl disc and translate those vibrations into sounds coming out of your speakers. It was analog. What the hell? And then to add to this experience, you would read those magazines. There was no MTV. There was no way of really marketing this stuff outside of reading the tabloids, word of mouth, and then your favorite band. And it was a band. It wasn't a song. It wasn't a DJ. It wasn't a playlist. It was an album from a band, about 35 to 45 minutes long, 20 minutes on a side. The songs intricately arranged to tell a story, take you on a journey. That was almost that length of time, right? And then the band would tour. And then you couldn't wait to go see them, just like you and I couldn't wait to go see them. Chicago, Philadelphia, New York. And then you would go physically see the band play the album along with their older hits, and then rinse, repeat, season to season. And it was the most glorious aspect, I think, of our youth.
Yeah, the thing that I go back to is it there was a mystery about it too, right? Like you said, the only information we could obtain was through the album, occasionally through a blurb on a radio station that somebody was touring or somebody may stop by to talk. There wasn't any media. There wasn't social media. There wasn't TV until MTV came out a little bit later, but it was shrouded in mystery, and you got your information by Circus Magazine or Cream, very rarely Rolling Stone for the prog rock type of stuff, but you know that's where you got your information. And then the more musical bands, the more bands that had that expertise in playing, sort of elevated and graduated into guitar player or guitar world, and then it's spun into bass player over time and modern drummer. And you'd have these interviews with these musicians about the musicianship part of it, and you miss a lot of that today, right? That mystery isn't there. Everything is so accessible. And I can remember, looking through Circus Magazine and like, oh, wow, that's what Geddy Lee looks like. Oh, look at that equipment that Alex Lifeson is using. You could really, sink your teeth into whatever little bit of information you had. And to this day, I still probably have most of those Circus magazines from the mid to late 70s and early 80s with my favorite bands in them. I've never given them away. I'll probably never give them away, and probably give them to my kids. It's that it just embodied everything about the music, and and you had such limited access to any information that you wanted to hold it tight and really be a part of it. And I think that's something that in today's world, it becomes so accessible. Your musicians are on Instagram, and they're on YouTube and whatever, which is great in its own right. And seeing some of that old material that just pops up on YouTube, the old videos, and people have things that are restored. It's amazing what's out there and what shows up from time to time. But growing up in the late 70s and 80s, you felt like you had to do the hard work, you had to research, and you had to remember. And to this day, I'm sure you're the same. Like, you remember, who produced this album, where was it recorded. All those little details matter because that's all you had. You just would look at that album over and over and over again, memorize the lyrics, put the needle on the record and let it go. And if you were a musician and started playing an instrument, like I know you play guitar and I play bass, you would be putting that needle over and over and over and over and trying to figure out that song. There wasn't support on YouTube with transcriptions and tablature and all that stuff. You had to put in the hard work to be able to figure those songs out. And that was part of the beauty too. If you extended beyond just listening and being a listener and a fan, and you wanted to learn how to play an instrument, you had to put in the hard work, and that's something that we're missing today.
100,000%. Information scarcity creates even higher demand. We were hungry, we were starving for every little morsel. And to your other great point, it was very much inside sports because we were clutching at straws for every little bit that we could get. We were grinding through records so we could figure out that lick. Remember, the record spun at 33 revolutions per minute, and some turntables had a slower setting.
Yeah, yeah.
So you would put it, what was it, 14 or 12, and then you would put it on that slower setting. 22, I think, was the setting. So you put it on from 33 to 22 to hear the lick better, but then it would change the frequency
Yeah.
of the notes, and then you would have to adjust accordingly. But you would grind through it just like our heroes ground through it. There was information scarcity. There wasn't YouTube. There wasn't Instagram for Jimmy Page. He sat there and he burned through vinyl just like we did. So there was this camaraderie of working hard to just squeeze whatever we could out of it. And just like baseball, where the 90-mile-an-hour fastball is now just standard, people have gotten better and better at the craftsmanship. You just randomly scroll through social media, you're on Instagram, and you have 6-year-olds playing Randy Rhoads licks perfectly. And that is charming and it's amazing. And I'm personally glad to see that these guitar gods and the musicians that we worshiped growing up are still part of the pantheon and are now being emulated with great fondness. But I think what's lost is the emotion and the passion behind it. Now it's kind of like fossilized curios that the kids are digging up in their yard and they're polishing it and making it their own, which again is terrific. But you and I know that growing up in that era, it was literally a religious experience. And the less we had, the more we wanted. And the more we got, the more we wanted even more.
Yeah, yeah, and I think about those times, and like to your point about the scarcity of information. So we even looked to see where those bands were branching out, and I can remember years ago putting together sort of you see these sort of family tree things that appear from time to time, like the evolution of a band. And I can remember that I started one myself. It was handwritten of like, okay, if I start with King Crimson, like where does that lead me to? Right? So I have Greg Lake, and that leads me to ELP. And then I have Robert Fripp, which leads me to Brian Eno and David Bowie. And then I have Tony Levin, who leads me to 500 different musicians because of his studio work. And I have Bill Bruford, who leads me to Yes and UK. Right, like, and then you start looking at those connections. Oh, and Adrian Belew was in King Crimson, and he played with Zappa and Talking Heads and Bowie, and it evolved into this, like, if I like them here, I'm probably going to like them there. And that's the way you got exposed to different types of music sometimes. I was like, oh, I wonder if what this Brand X is. Phil Collins plays on it. I like Genesis, so let me see what Phil does on Brand X. And then you go there and you're listening to this incredible progressive music, instrumental, Percy Jones, unbelievable fretless bass player. And then it just takes you somewhere else, right? Like it's all these connections, but you had to work for it. And it's great that you can kind of search now and find it. But when you like found it yourself and did the digging and did the research and did the reading and bought an album and put it on. Like, I remember buying Unorthodox Behavior by Brand X, and I put it on my turntable, and like I had no idea what it was going to sound like. I knew Collins played in it. I knew it was going to be pretty decent. I knew of Percy Jones, but man, I put that stuff on and I was blown away. And that just led me into more more progressive type of music, more jazz fusion, got me into like Return to Forever and Weather Report. And it just spiraled from that point on.
I hope you kept that taxonomy map because, drum roll please, I remember you showing it to me.
I do have it.
You showed it to me, and it was jaw-dropping for me because A, of course Kevin would do this, and B, of course he would actually have it at the office to kind of glance at and ruminate throughout his busy workday. And C, of course he's showing it to me because he knows I'm passionate about it and could really appreciate the effort that went into it, but also the relationships and interrelationships between this evolving organism that was essentially progressive alternative rock that had, if you put the Venn diagram together, it had overlap with a little bit of new wave, the beginning of industrial, the pre-punk, post-punk era, and the like, right? Which was
Yeah. Yeah.
this moving, shaping, evolving organism of music, with the milestones and the pinpoints, the network nodes, if you will, of these all-star famous musicians who knew each other, played in each other's bands, and kept the industry and the music and the art flowing forward.
Well, I think what's interesting there too, and I imagine, I wanted to do it just because that's how I'm wired, and I wanted to see the interconnectivity of all these people and who they collaborated with. Because sometimes you get locked into like, this is my band, and you don't even know that somebody else, was a guest musician on something, right? And it gets really interesting when you figure those things out and you're exposed to more music. But it's one of those things that I actually took that and I was like a poster paper size. And then years later, I kind of connected a smaller version to it with like the 90s bands. And I think my central focus may have been, it might have been Tool. And, then you can branch out to other things with them and who Maynard plays with Pucifer and A Perfect Circle and Billy Howardell. And then you link what they've just done on that last tour, that Sasanta tour, which was fabulous. One of the best shows I've ever seen. We can talk about the Hollywood Bowl show where Tool showed up and played Anima as part of the encore. But you connect even different periods and kind of follow that same sort of structure where people play. And Adrian Belew, another great connector, played with Trent Reznor and Nine Inch Nails and things like that. They're all connected, and they're even more passionate today because they're still around doing it. And I recently saw uh, the version of the '80s King Crimson band that recently came around called Beat, where you had Adrian Belew and Tony Levin from that '80s period of Crimson playing, and with the blessing of Robert Fripp, who didn't want to do it. That material was really Adrian Belew's baby. You could tell that the songwriting and the guitar playing were really his. And although Crimson's Fripp's band, Adrian really kind of dominated on those three albums. And they got Steve Vai to play the Fripp parts, with Robert Fripp's blessing on that as well. And who other than Danny Carey from Tool to play Bruford's parts, which kind of came full circle for him. I remember seeing pictures of him in a Discipline T-shirt, listening to Discipline back in the '80s, and here he is on stage playing Bill Bruford's parts. So that those generations can kind of connect because of that fandom that some of these musicians had that passion. So you it's kind of mixing the old and the new together, through music. That total, organic organism that we call music.
Yeah, and within that organic organism, there are various tribes of practitioners and their fans. The tribe that we're talking about might not be familiar to some listeners. And if we can, let's spend a couple minutes zeroing in on what you mean and understand air quote prog rock to be progressive, rock. We started this conversation talking about Rush, and as I mentioned, they were ostracized and rejected critically. And just as Blondie was booed off the stage, like you mentioned, in the early days, Rush got a lot of friction too. They had a loyal fandom, but they had trouble getting on the radio, and they were very much a marginalized band, probably until Tom Sawyer, the motion pictures hit as a number one song on the radio. Then they became legit. They went mainstream. But you mentioned a lot of bands like King Crimson, and I have my own favorites, which could be construed as the post-punk industrial scene, Joy Division and Echo and the Bunnymen. And these are alternative bands. They're not the top of the pop chart, and yet they have an enormous following, and even more significantly, a disproportionately large influence on music overall. So, can you talk a little bit about what attracted you to this tribe within a tribe? What makes prog rock special? Why are you passionate about it? How is it really different? Because some of the prog rock folks had hits, like remember David Bowie, he was a crossover
Yeah.
prog rocker. He was alternative. He was a little bit new wave. He set the stage even for Madonna with his different personality transformations. And then you have musicians who played like with Genesis, which we would consider a mainstream stadium filling band. Also playing with some of these alternative, lesser known bands.
Yeah, it's interesting because you have, where the music was always rooted in blues based, right? Like between the Stones and where it kind of came, where rock kind of came into existence. The contemporary rock, British rock, blues based material kind of transformed, and it turned into you know musicians who were a little bit more adept at their craft, maybe classically trained, maybe a jazz influence, that kind of pushed the envelope with musicianship and progressive rock. And you mentioned art rock too, and I think there is some crossover there, right? Like you have Bowie, who was incredibly creative in terms of his vision and what he wanted to put together, and more artistic in his expression. And then you expand that. It's interesting that I go back to like Yes, and Rick Wakeman played on some of Bowie's early albums, and Rick Wakeman was a prominent classical pianist that came into Yes, along with Steve Howe, who was just a tremendous talent on guitar, and then Bruford on drums, who was had a tremendous jazz influence. So you took all these sort of different types of genres in and of themselves, you combine it with musicianship and people who aspire to play a little bit more complex material. The arrangements are different. There are a lot of different parts that are playing. There are a lot of extended solos, and they let people shine. It wasn't your basic, three chord music, verse, chorus, bridge, intro, outro type stuff. It was comprehensive. It was conceptual, and a lot of bands like Jethro Tull and Yes kind of brought that to the forefront. I mean, Thick as a Brick is one song that you flip side one into side two, and it's thick as a brick. And they said, well, why not? We'll do another one, and we'll call it a passion play, right? And then you had Yes with probably the seminal prog rock album, Close to the Edge. I mean, arguably, probably the most progressive thing to that point. 3 songs. Side one is Close to the Edge, and just taking musicianship to its highest level. And then they would infuse, like live, they would have that artistry. They'd have videos, they have elaborate stage sets. Similar to what Pink Floyd did in the day with the video screens and things that they did. But the progressive musicians kind of took the music to a higher level. They may not have taken it as seriously as we thought they did. In seeing interviews with like Rick Wakeman and other musicians, they're like, I kind of knew what I was doing. I didn't play anything the same twice, but I had like sort of milestones that I knew where the changes were, and I could move into the other part. That's how adept they were. They were trained. A lot of them. They could read music. Some of them, but they kind of notched it to another level. And to me, as a fledgling bassist and wanting to learn how to play, I didn't want to play root fifth octave type stuff. You hear that bass on Close to the Edge or Relayer from Yes, and it's just growling, that Rickenbacker that Chris Squire had. And then you know Geddy Lee kind of you know, kind of progressed, that yes feel within the Rush music. You had those people who were in the forefront of playing, and those were the progressive rock musicians. And then you notched it up a level if you kind of branched out into like fusion, right? You had jazz fusion with Return to Forever and Stanley Clarke and Al Di Meola, Chick Corea, and then you move into Weather Report with Jocko and Joe Zawinul and Wayne Shorter and those types of guys. It was just, if you could aspire to play and you could master some of those songs, you felt like you really could accomplish anything. So I always just wanted to try to reach that level of being able to play some of that stuff, because I figured if I could play that stuff, I could play anything. And to this day, you still push and you still try to learn certain things and you evolve. But I think that was the thing that really hit a nerve in me, that I wanted to be a good musician. I wanted to be able to play things, and these guys were at the top of their craft.
Yeah, definitely a participatory sport. And the tougher it was, the more we would knuckle down and try to learn it. I bought a guitar and I used to hang out with a neighborhood rock band. And I remember the struggle of just trying to tune the thing and the calluses on my fingers. And the more brutal it was, and the more uphill I had to go without a Sherpa up Everest. That was so glorious, and I just couldn't give up. And my epiphany for what we would consider this progressive rock revelation was in the basement of my friend Ed's house. He had a party room down there, and Ed was always miles ahead of many of the rest of us in our little friend group. I liked the Led Zeppelin and the Black Sabbath and the Judas Priest. I liked the heavy guitar, kind of standard metal that was floating around. And Ed was into some of the freaky stuff, like David Bowie, like you mentioned, and Brian Eno, who was the
Yeah.
keyboard player and vocalist with Roxy Music. He split with the band and then went solo, and his first solo record, "Here Come the Warm Jets," was really revolutionary in its own way in that genre. And I remember having headphones on, and there might have been certain chemicals involved at this point, but I am listening to a song called "Babies on Fire." And out of nowhere, after these freaky stanzas from Brian Eno about heifers on fire and babies burning up, the most ripping atonal guitar solo I had ever heard in my own life ripped into my brain. And it was Robert Fripp letting loose on that song. And to this day, I'm going to put the link in the description. It is the greatest guitar solo I've ever heard in my life. And part of the reason that I was so blown away by it was because it's just so off the reservation. It is, again, atonal, grinding. Is it pleasant to listen to? Well, it's an acquired taste, like most of the best things in life are. It's grinding, it's grating, it has no tonic center. And yet, it is so unbelievably expressive. It was an undiscovered country. It was like living under a sonic rock until that moment, and I was never the same afterward. It blew open my horizons for what I considered aesthetically aesthetically normal, if you will? What are the boundaries of good taste and appropriateness in music? And all of a sudden, I went from this tiny little box to the observable universe. And that to me epitomizes, I think, a lot of what you're talking about, which is you could listen to the hits on the radio, and they are deliberately designed for the lowest common denominator, for feet to be tapping, for an arm around your date, for processed tones that can sell ads. And the music that we were into was its own specialty for people who appreciated music and wanted music to be more than just background sounds. We wanted music to take us to that next level. And I think we're in violent agreement that the music that we're both passionate about isn't just waves through the air and the tapping of our feet, but it's a transformation of how we see ourselves in the world. And this stuff did the trick and continues to do so. As you say, we're getting older, the musicians are getting older, but they're still out there playing. And just to cap my enthusiasm with something that's very, very positive about the scene right now, the minions and the big stadiums are being filled by old acts, but the newer acts like the Taylor Swifts. And the folks who are interested in the King Crimsons, just like you mentioned, Beat was reconstituted with Steve Vai in that iconic Fripp role. We could see them in intimate venues. When I was living in New York not long ago, I went to a small club in the Village and I saw Peter Murphy. I stood 3 feet from Peter Murphy the entire show, and there might have been only 200 people in that little room. And that was to me a dream come true. It was coming full circle between these mythical figures where we had limited information at the far end of a huge stadium to smelling them on stage only a few feet away as we all get older together and we love the same experience.
Yeah, that's the irony of it all, right? When we were growing up, the mystery was there. We could barely find any information. We would go to a show, we might see them, on an interview somewhere. But now, as they have aged with us, they're playing smaller places. They're accessible. They're on, social media. And, for some of the bands that were kind of a little bit post progressive, where, the late 80s, early 90s, which, an interesting period. I was thinking about this, of how those progressive bands had to try to recreate themselves and be relevant through, synth rock, and, that period where sampling came into being. And you look at that period, in the mid 80s, where what did Yes turn into, right? Like they had so many lineup changes and things, but they reformed with a new, with a new band, primarily, with Trevor Rabin playing guitar, and they brought back some of the other guys, but their sound and even their look changed. Jethro Tull really was trying to find its identity. I mean, a band that was rooted in blues-based material, and sort of folk, and into the prog type of scene, in the mid of their career. Where do they go in an age of electronics, when, they were just based on guitar, drums, and bass and vocals, and for them with flute? But like, how does flute become relevant in the mid 80s, when you're sequencing and sampling? And it was a kind of interesting period, and a lot of them kind of struggled through that period, and the ones that were able to evolve and then come on top of it, they went back to their roots. Rush is a perfect example, right? Like they kind of hit that cusp with Permanent Waves and Moving Pictures in the early 80s, and then Signals came out after that, which became a little bit more keyboardy. And then, you go into like Grace Under Pressure, Power Windows, Hold Your Fire, where was Alex Lifeson in the band, right? You hear these stories that he's like, I didn't know what to really do. That, like, the guitar was sort of a rhythm type of thing here with all the keyboards. But then, they kind of came full circle and said, who are we really? That's not us. We want to play. So, the latter stuff, they started to evolve a little bit more with like counterparts and getting back to that, that bass, drums, and guitar that really drove them forward and established them in their career. But I think it's really interesting that those bands that kind of were able to stick through it have become accessible. And some of the bands that I listened to, like in the '90s, like Nine Inch Nails are coming around again, and Primus is coming around again as part of the Sasanta tour, and they're accessible. I actually went to like a meet and greet with Primus because it's affordable, and you get to see these people and talk to them, and and realize that you know truly they are just people, and they're incredibly talented, and they're passionate about what they do. But it's great to kind of see them in that environment where they're Les Claypool plays at local bars in his hometown. I mean, it's that type of an environment now for them that not everybody really knows me now because I'm 60 years old, but I have a great fan base, and those people are passionate, so I can be comfortable around them to some degree. So I think it's interesting how the evolution and the accessibility has actually played a part of that resurgence in later years for some of these bands.
I love it. I love it. And when you get to meet them and see them and experience them in smaller venues, it takes you back to your youth, but in a way that you could truly appreciate as an older guy. And I love that circularity and the evolutionary bumps that you describe, especially in the 80s and 90s with keyboards and the like. Everyone was struggling with that. Metallica had their Saint Anger phase, ZZ Top with Legs, Van Halen also with the keyboard, which actually helped propel them to their first number one hit, Jump. So you had good and bad with this struggle of trying to keep up with the Joneses. And it's fascinating that even these alternative prog rock bands felt the pressure to transform. They were always on the brink of being big, and they no doubt had the pressure of crossing over into that territory. Why are we opening for this other band that has 1/10 our talent and range? We could be the mainliner in the stadium. Why don't we go for it? So that temptation to sell more tickets and more records, that temptation to become that which everyone always expected you to be was no doubt there. And eventually things kind of settle into the rhythm of how they started. It's true in our personal lives too. Fake it until you make it, and then you make it, and then you don't need to fake it. And it's something to appreciate and reflect on. But moving forward, where do you think things are headed? And this is a super complicated question because out from under us, the industry has evolved. So I remember when compact discs first came out, they were this interim phase between 12-inch vinyl and streaming digital. And everyone went nuts that the bottom had literally and figuratively dropped out of music. The bass and the drums were muffled. The mid range was out of control, and the highs were screechy. Remember, everyone was like, "These sound like shit." And the convenience of the CD superseded vinyl. Eventually, the records did go away in the same way that Blockbuster Video had to close down. The inexorable and inevitable trajectory of technology. And then Napster revolutionized things by making the ability to download songs independent of computer platform. No one really talks about Napster, but that was the real revolution in bridge. And then you had bands like Metallica going nuts. How dare our songs be recorded and distributed without our permission and without our profit? And Napster was clearly ahead of its time, both technologically and in terms of what was considered copyright, bands' rights, music. And even Metallica finally smelled the coffee and realized that 100 times more people are listening to our content than ever before, thanks to the ubiquity of digital streaming. And then you had Spotify evolve and their kin, where, the musicians get pennies on the download, but the availability of music is unprecedented. I'm sure you've probably still got all your records, and I bet you if you have one record less than 500 records, I'm gonna jump out the window right now. But I can see your garage just stocked from the floor to the ceiling with records. But now my phone with my Spotify account or my YouTube Music account has literally 1,000 times the recorded hours of music that's cataloged and instantly accessible. So there's a lot to be said for the convenience of technology. I've heard songs from bands that I adored that I've never heard in my entire life because I couldn't afford all their albums. And
Right.
I spent several years after the streaming services really took off just catching up on the music that I had missed. So there's definitely some positive to what's going on. But that all said, I'll just put a capper on my little dirge here by saying that the quality of music, and I sound like an old fogey. I sound like the neighbor who used to yell at us for playing Led Zeppelin and calling it trash. When I look at the top 10 streaming songs, I'm kind of like, really? And I think it goes beyond just an old fogey not getting into what the young people are getting into. I think the quality of music and the kind of music has categorically and qualitatively changed because of the accessibility, but also the shift away from bands and records and albums to songs and to remixes. It seems like DJs are more popular
Yeah.
than the artists themselves. And people are no longer into artists. They're just into the song that's on their playlist. And it's all so disposable that no one gives a shit. It's just from one hit, one trending tune to the other. And everyone's lost in this sea of music, and all taste has gone out the window. So that's just my take generally on what's happened.
Yeah, I think, I recently saw an interview with Rick Wakeman, again, the keyboardist from Yes, and he was talking about the music industry as well. And he made a really great point that the industry, through its evolution of all those mediums, right? Like you go from vinyl. I mean, you go vinyl and 8 track, and then you
Ah,
go
yeah, yeah,
then you
A-track.
yeah, and then that's great. It goes to a completely different song in the middle of the song on the second track. So I don't know how viable that medium was, but you had vinyl. Really, you had the radio to start, right? Like you had to listen to things on the radio, and then it evolved into vinyl that you could purchase and you had access to, and then they kind of came out with 8 track and then cassettes, and they poo-pooed tape recording your own vinyl, and trying to get you to buy cassettes and the album if you wanted to listen to a cassette. And then, like you said, it evolved into you had the CD come out, and then MP3s, and then streaming services with Napster and things like that. But what was interesting with Rick Wakeman's perspective, he said through all that, the music industry got it wrong, and they got it wrong because they based their model on exclusion instead of inclusion, where he thought that why not have all those mediums available, right? And remember the old days where you could actually go into a Tower Records and go into a listening room, right? You could get some music and you could put headphones on and you could experience it and you could see if you really wanted it, right? He was thinking of, why wasn't it inclusionary instead of exclusionary? We wanted you to have vinyl, and then we didn't want you to have vinyl. We wanted you to have the next thing. Why not make those choices available and let the audience decide how they want to digest their own music? If you like vinyl and you like that sort of analog sound, which I love, we grew up with that experience. It's a different way to listen to music. Why not have all the options available? And there may be a market for that moving forward, because we see a resurgence of vinyl. We see, like you said, the end of the baby boomers and moving in, and then, their children are getting exposed to vinyl. We're seeing a resurgence there. But I thought it was interesting the way he kind of put it, that they got it wrong. They should have been more inclusionary and said, we'll give you a choice. I'm sure there were cost implications with producing different mediums and, having CDs and vinyl and cassettes and all those things available at once, but they almost force fed it to us. And I remember being in that mode. Like, I had the album. Oh no, now the CD's coming out. I have to buy the CD. So I had every album, I had every CD. And like you said, and now I have everything on my phone. But the accessibility is one thing. It's great to have it, but giving people the choice of how they want to receive their music, I think, is important. And I thought it was an interesting perspective from him. And to the accessibility part, I think Tool and King Crimson were the last two bands to allow their music to be on iTunes. They finally realized that they would have broader exposure, with that accessibility, and that's what they were at the time. They were digging into their artistry, and they wouldn't allow it. But over time, they said, maybe it's a good thing if we can reach a broader audience. So, it's one of those things that it kind of comes full circle to some degree, and I agree with you. It's we're at a crossroads with where the music industry is, and people understanding what that experience is. And I think once people are exposed to the experience of getting an album and listening to it and really, you know, just kind of immersing yourself in it. Not only the music, but the artistry behind it, the lyric sheets, like you said, and then amazingly, if there was a poster inside of the album, I remember, Dark Side of the Moon had the poster, right? Jethro Tull's Thick as a Brick unfolded into a full newspaper, like that tangible, organic piece of art. You just don't get that with streaming at all. You don't even get the lyrics. You have to kind of chase them down half the time to see if you can get them. But it's interesting to see how it's kind of taking shape, and then people are kind of bringing back some of those older bands, or making their music available on vinyl, and you can access it that way, and trying to trying to carry that torch through that we had when we were younger. And it was interesting. I was part of that Q&A. I remember somebody asked Les Claypool, how do we support you in continuing to make the music that you make, with whether it's Primus, or is Fearless Flying Frog Brigade, or the Claypool Lennon Delirium, which is absolutely fabulous. And his answer was, you need to come to the shows. He goes, creating music, recording music, and releasing it now is cost of entry. They don't make a lot of money producing that material anymore. It's on the touring, it's on the merchandise, it's on the other things, right? So to be able to support that live music, you have to go see the band. And seeing the band, to me, is the ultimate. Being able to see them just pull stuff off that you're like, wow, how are they going to do this? And then when they do it, you're like, yeah, that was pretty awesome that they can still do that. So a lot of fodder there to consider in terms of the evolution of it. But I think it goes back to where it all started, right? You want to go see a live band, you want to have that experience, and you want to kind of create that full circle experience by having something tangible at its roots when you first start and listen to that music.
Absolutely. Like every business, you got to follow the money. And when artists can no longer make their royalties from the music, back in the day, how much did we buy an album for? An album was $9.95, if I remember.
There was an old store near me called Corvettes, and we used to go to Corvettes and buy. I remember I bought a Farewell to Kings. I think it was $4.97, $4.97.
Right,
just
right.
just yeah, and you look at that in perspective, and so you're paying like $15 a month to have access to everything possible. It's like, how can they possibly make money from that when I'm paying the cost of one CD back in our day, and I have access to any material that comes out of any band. And
Yeah, you were paying 25 cents a song.
yeah,
And now, again, to your point, for 10, $15, you have unlimited access to every song. Keep your phone on, plugged into your Bluetooth power speaker 24/7, all yours, baby, for a fraction of a penny per
yeah,
song. So who's making the money? And the answer is, well, the streaming service is ripping everyone off. But how much trickles back to the artist? Not much. Now, here's the flip side of that, though. Back in the old system, there were only a handful of bands. That was it, because there was limited bandwidth. Part of it was this monetization schemata, right? It's like if you were going to go to a record store, you're going to lay out your $5-10. You can't buy 20 records from 20 bands. It's limited. The other factor was the studio system. So bands would gig. The famous Van Halen story that on a rainy Tuesday evening at Gazzari's, Mo Austin was convinced to go see this young band. And the only reason Van Halen got signed is because he recognized "You Really Got Me" from the Kinks, and he thought that they did a cool cover of it. Boom, Van Halen was made. So every band had this apocryphal story about, air quote, being discovered. And then they would have an agent, and the agent would hustle to liaise with the studio, and then they would get a cut for their first record, and then they would tour, and then the studio would take a percentage of the tour, and they were constantly at war with each other, to the point Frank Zappa toured on his Zoot Allures sojourn with a huge banner that said "Warner Brothers sucks." They were always fighting, remember? But
yeah,
the system overall, though, could only tolerate a limited number of top acts. Now, go to Spotify, go to any of the streaming services, and there's literally, no exaggeration, tens of thousands of artists. So you could be a guy with a laptop, not even playing an instrument, or just plugging in a xylophone and going for it, and you've got a Spotify channel. So the plus side of this flip around, literally diametrically opposite to the situation we had before, was anyone can get distribution. The magic commodity now isn't even money, it's attention. Listen, what are you going to listen to? Well, if there's 80,000 musicians on Spotify, well, as listeners, we've got limited bandwidth too. So the streaming companies are now like the studios. They are God. Selected songs. And now you have ghost artists who are creating look-alike copies of recognizable songs to slip into playlists so Spotify doesn't have to pay royalties. And this segues into the next part of the conversation that I'd love to hear your opinion about, which is AI. We are rapidly heading to a place where, just like ChatGPT or DAL-E or Grok 3, you enter in as a prompt, write me a song that's got a singer in the style of David Bowie with a guitar player like Eddie Van Halen and a drummer like Neil Peart, playing a prog rock Tool-like song in the key of B, but with a swing beat and lyrics taken from the book Alice in Wonderland. And then you hit return, and then within minutes, seconds, out comes your song. Now what? Now what's going to happen? There's only certain genres that are there. You've got cowboy westerns, and now you've got Beyonce who's flipping genres. You've got punk, you've got reggae, you've got prog rock. You have all these different styles, and they all get plugged into the AI. What's our grandkids gonna be listening to? Is it gonna be this like spreadsheet EDM written by the machines, or are they gonna emulate the King Crimsons and David Bowies of before? I mean, what the hell is happening, and where the hell are we headed?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's on our shoulders. I think we have to expose our kids to that music and the various media that we grew up with. You know, it will never go away. The evolution of it and AI, it's kind of scary, um, because what drew us to the musicianship were real people with real ideas and real creativity. We wanted to see what they would come out with next. Like, can can there be a follow up, to Dark Side of the Moon, right?
Right. The
Oh,
drama, the human
yeah,
drama.
yeah,
Like and then they're toiling in the studio and they're staring at each other and they got writer's block because they're working on Wish You Were Here, and then what do you follow up Dark Side of the Moon with?
yeah. You
And
know,
then he reaches, and then Rick Wright hits a G chord on the synthesizer, and then the whole studio goes silent, and then David Gilmour plays that one signature lick, and they knew they had something. That's
yeah, yeah,
creativity,
yeah.
right?
Well, that's where it's the nexus of creativity. Like, where does it come from? Like, from within, where are you going to take it next? What's in your mind, body, and soul that you're going to emit? And it's those things that I think really made us hang on. And of course, everything in life becomes a comparator. Well, it wasn't as good as Dark Side. Wish You Were Here was great, but it wasn't as good as that. But how about Animals? I happen to like Animals better than both of those because of the
100%. Another
of
high
yeah,
five just for
yeah,
the record.
yeah. The
Yeah.
the the mysteriousness of Animals, and again, probably one of the least sort of eh, mainstream accessible albums by Floyd, but to me, the cohesion and sort of the allegory and pulling off of Orwell's Animal Farm, like, you don't get that, right? You just don't,
Yeah.
like, you don't get that anymore. But that's what would draw me to that type of music too. Like, where did they come up with this idea? And they read a book, and like you mentioned, Neil Peart. I mean, the guy was a voracious reader. So where did he come up with these ideas to craft these incredible lyrics? Which for me, as a lyricist, and the words that he put to that music that Getty and Alex would write, it was just a perfect relationship there with the music. And those lyrics were my anthem through my adolescence. I would read them over and over. I can remember writing them all the time in my notebook when I was in high school. I'd write them on the desk, and people would write on that desk and request another lyric that I would write the next day when I wasn't paying attention in calculus class. And I would write Free Will or Spirit of Radio, the full lyrics, because I memorized them. And I was so into it, you know, aside from everything else that I did, whether it was, an education or my career, the music was always that common thread to kind of get me through. But what drove me was sort of that, what's next? What are they going to come with next? And it was like clockwork. Remember, the tours were always the same. Jethro Tull always toured in October, and it was every year. Think about that. Think about the creativity and just the sheer musicianship and inspiration that these musicians had. I mean, how could Ian Anderson at 24 years old write Aqualung? At 25, write Thick as a Brick, right? At like 26, write a passion play. I mean, it's amazing. They were so young and they were so creative because they didn't have any other, influences but reading and experiences. They were life experiences. They were influenced by what they read, and it just came through them in like a 10-month period. Like there were literally, go back through the 70s and late 60s and early 70s, all the bands that we loved pretty much released an album every 1 to 2 years. That's unheard of now. Absolutely unheard of. You have, bands that are still around, like U2 and whatnot, takes 10 years to do it. I mean, I even look at Tool, but I know they had some, they were in some, legal and litigation over some albums. They released 10,000 Days when my kids were born, and the next release, my kids were like 15 years old. They came out with the an album in 2018, Fear Inoculum. But there was like, it was like a 14-15 year period between those albums. Back in the day, you know, 71 you had an album by, by Floyd. 72 you had another one. 73, 74, 75. Right? There might be a 2 year period where they needed to work on the wall or something like that, but you consistently had music like year after year after year, and that anticipation of like, it's October. I think Tull will be coming around on tour, or you know, Rush released A Farewell to Kings in '77. When's the next one coming out? Well, it's going to be '78, and that's going to be Hemispheres, right? So you just had that just anticipation was part of it because they were creative and they were always working on it, and they were always trying to hone their craft and get better, and we supported that. And I still think that's part of it, of attending and seeing live music, because that's how it was intended to be. These bands made money on touring. That's the way they promoted their music back in the day. You could hear a couple songs on the radio, but if you really wanted all of it, you had to go see them and experience it. So, it's a challenging time in one respect, but I think we, as people that have grown through that period and the evolution of all the different mediums that music has come in our lives, we're the ones that kind of have to push that forward, because if we let it die, then that experience will die with our kids and their kids and everybody moving forward.
I think that heart is what it's all about. It's the ghost in the machine. Remember that Police album?
Yes,
It's Synchronicity. Remember that other one?
I saw
Which
both of
is,
those tours.
of course you did. The human component is one of irrationality, not logic. The human component is one of struggle and strife. A lot of these bands were feuding. You mentioned the lawsuit that Tool endured. There's lawsuits all over the place. The Smiths. Name a band and somebody's suing somebody else. Get into the production of some of these iconic albums, including our favorite, Animals. You had David Gilmour, who was partly checked out. You had Roger Waters, who was simmering in animosity, feeling that he was doing most of the work, an animosity that translated into the wall. You have the Beatles, who fired Ringo. I think you've got Paul McCartney playing drums on Back in the USSR. The turmoil, the hatred, the egomania that's behind the scenes is very, very human, but it's also the crucible out of which amazing creativity is released. Some of the best slow hand guitar work ever recorded on planet Earth is Gilmour laying tracks on Animals while Roger Waters is a second away from firing him and bringing in Eric Clapton. So I think that's another thing that's missing in this rush to digitization, to artificial intelligence, that there's this inherent intentionality and conflict and struggle in the human condition, out of which comes a certain intent and energy, this frothy artistry that from the receiving end, just like you describe, I can't wait for that next record to come out. And the last show, I got my ass kicked because I was in the mosh pit. And in the next show, I kicked someone else's ass and I got drunk and I fell down and my girlfriend dumped me. So, around this fandom that we're both sharing, our full 360 human lives with all of their discord, with all of their struggle, with all of the strife that we live through each and every day, music becomes a catharsis and a projection of not only the good stuff but the bad stuff. And until a machine can have a real world experience, even if it's simulated, it's going to be a mechanical exercise in regurgitation. And as audience members, as fans, as musicians, amateur musicians who love this shit so much that we want to recreate it, it's not just about the waveforms in the air. It's not just that A is 440. It's not just that this is a 5/4 beat in 110 time. It's a human experience created by human beings to communicate human passion. And I think you nail it, which is that's why we loved it. That's why we go to see shows. That's why we like talking to the musicians. And that's why it's been such an integral part of all of our lives, because it's a living, breathing expression of who we are as humans. And that you can never really take away by any machine or any top 10 hit.
Yeah, and you think about, you talk about just artistry in general, like through the years and through whether it's music or whether it's painting. You always hear those stories about it's the human condition that these people are going through, the pain, the depression, the joy. It's all those emotions together, and we always seem to find those artists that are a little bit in pain, that are a little bit, you know, not feeling part of the society at large, that they become ultra creative. And I was thinking about this, a few days ago when, grunge started taking shape, right? Like you had that influx of those musicians, the Seattle scene, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, and then, kind of grunge like Alice in Chains, and then I would throw like STP in there, but they were a little bit different from that. Still grunge like, but not part of the big three. Out of the Seattle scene, and out of those bands, those five bands that I mentioned, only one singer has survived to this day. Four of them are gone. You have Lane Staley, who's no longer here. You have Kurt Cobain. You have Chris Cornell, and you have Scott Weiland. And those are people that were in pain. They were suffering to some degree, and it's music at least allowed them in the period that they were here to express that pain and to try to give us something emotive and to try to connect and try to reach them, right? So it's really interesting that that's something you're never ever going to get through AI and, machine generated music. That experience and that emotiveness. So when you listen to some of those tunes from those bands back in that period, like the just sheer power of Cornell and just like the chameleon like nature of Scott Weiland, just could sing anything. I was listening to number 4 STP album a few days ago, and the last tune on that, Atlanta, is just mesmerizing. His voice is just mesmerizing. And then, of course, everyone knows the Kurt Cobain story. And then, Lane Staley, who just was an incredible vocalist, and the harmonies that him and Cantrell like put together with Alice in Chains, to me, kind of stood out in that period. That you didn't really have that with some of the other bands. But it all stemmed from, the human condition and pain, and being able to express in a way to try to connect, with the larger world and the larger universe. And you're just not going to get that, as we move forward.
Yeah, Ziggy Stardust was David Bowie's Dark Side of the Moon. He was young, and all of a sudden, he went from hunky dory to the super rock star embodied, ironically enough, by his Ziggy character. And he bottomed out. And it reached an apex when he was being interviewed by one of the music rags, and he freaked out during the interview, and the journalist asked him, well, what's wrong? And then Bowie said, well, I just saw a body plummet through my line of sight out that window. And at that point, he knew that he was at the end of his rope, and he had to detox. And then he moved to Berlin, and out came some of his best work, the album Low, which pretty much ushered in the industrial phase of the new wave, and then Heroes. And that launched a whole new phase, not only of his career, but in a sense, a genre of this alternative music. And I think you bring up a really great point that it's not just the conflict between the musicians in a group setting, that team building exercise that goes to hell, which is just about every rock band, almost in a cliche kind of way, like, VH1 behind the music. Every story was the same, right? Like
Yeah.
young, struggling musicians make it, and then all hell breaks loose. Drug addiction, infidelity, destroyed families. Will the band be able to keep it together? Cliche, but true. And you're absolutely right that the dynamo of this whole thing, sex and drugs and rock and roll, and when you put them all together in a mix, it's really the essence of the human condition with all of its grandeur and all of its shittiness. And also, to your point, some of the most troubled artists are, not surprisingly, the most creative, and they're always skirting the edge. And sometimes it's lethal what they do. So literally it's life or death for them to get that album out, to continue to express themselves. And many, frankly, ended their own lives or precipitated their own demise when they felt that the muse no longer shined upon them. When they would pick up that guitar or that microphone and they felt that their talent was gone. What do they do now? So it's a tough road to take, and we appreciate those who have taken it, and then we pick up our guitar and our bass and our drums to recapture some of that music. And to your other great point, it's about the next generation, which is instilling them with this enthusiasm, with this passion, that the times have changed and the industry has changed and the artists have changed, and a lot of these old fogies are still touring, but they're gonna die and we're gonna die. And hopefully, if we leave any kind of mark, then it's a mark of transferring this enthusiasm and this passion for tapping into the heart and soul of what makes us human and why life is worth living. And music, and especially the music we grew up with and continue to love, really epitomizes that kind of passion and energy.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. It's just, it's up to us. It's up to us really to help propel that forward, and and try to expose our kids and their kids, to what it means to create, and that expression that comes from within. We say how accessible and how easy it is to become a musician these days, right? You can sample, you can pick up any sort of technology, and kind of write your own material. And it's more than that, and it's more meaningful, I think, to the person creating it, and more meaningful to the listener, when they know something is coming from someone else's soul, And you hear it all the time. Like a lot of the great bands that we listen to, they're like, we write for ourselves and feel satisfied, and we hope that you like it. And then that's where that fandom comes, because we do like it. We want to know what's next. We want to know what you're into, how you're feeling, and see how that relays into the next piece of material that you're going to release. And to us, it was a concept, right? Like, what's that concept that they're going to be talking about on the next thing? Unlike today, where it's a song, it's number one, it's number two on the list. People don't even know the names of the songs. It's that was number three on that album. I see number number three coming up on my phone or in my car. But they
Right.
don't
That
even realize what the tune is. And there was a deliberate nature of how things were recorded and the order that they were, organized on an LP. Like, what was going to be side one, track one, and how are we going to end side one, and what would be side two or side B, track one. Right? There was a methodology and a strategy behind where you even place those songs on vinyl, and you just kind of lose that. And I think the technology, can, there's always a pro and a con around it. And I go back to Rush because I know them so well and know their music. The period where the first release on a CD, when CDs came out, was Hold Your Fire in 1987. And you go from a period of Permanent Waves, which has a handful of songs and is maybe 40-45 minutes long. And then fast forward from like 1980 to like 1987 to Hold Your Fire, and you have 75 minutes of material. You have like two albums on the one. And in my opinion, that album is the most diluted album that they ever produced. I think they were locked into, like, wow, we have the ability to put more and more and more. And it kind of, it diluted that Rush experience. There was so much material, there were so many tunes, and you just couldn't lock in like you could with Permanent Waves or Hemispheres or Moving Pictures, because the technology allowed you to do more. But I think sometimes less is more. And you listen to some of those old albums, and you brought up Frank Zappa. I mean, Zappa's been in my rotation the last couple months because I'm going to see his son play in a couple months. And I've been starting to listen to more of his material. And you look at, like, Overnight Sensation is probably like 40 minutes long, and every tune is great. Right? The musicianship is over the top. George Duke and all the great musicians that kind of went through what I call like Zappa University. I mean, musicians talk about, if you could play with Frank, it was like getting a degree from Juilliard. And all those guys like Steve Vai and Adrian Belew and Terry Bozzio and Wackerman and Tunis and Patrick O'Hearn, all, basically the whole Missing Persons band are Zappa alumni. But like, they were able to produce things in a very concise way and produce material year after year. And the technology kind of diluted the artistry to some degree, with the length of material that you could put on a CD.
Jack White of the White Stripes put it really well, reiterating exactly what you've been describing here. Ease of use is the biggest enemy of every artist. If it's too easy, then you're not fighting it. And if you're not fighting it, it's not going to bring out your best. The Play It Loud documentary film with Jack and The Edge from U2 and Jimmy Page is illuminating as well. There's one sequence where the Edge is all plugged into all of his delays and playing two notes repetitively, and you could tell that Jack White is just kind of over it because he deliberately plays through a shitty guitar and a shitty amp. When he played with Meg in the early White Stripes, the original incarnation, she had like a three-piece drum set: a snare drum, a bass drum, and a tom,
Yeah.
and one cymbal. The whole point was minimalism, and the whole point was just get down and dirty, feel the grit, live the grit, and be gritty, because it's not about the production. It's not about the craft in and of itself. It's about the emotional expression, going all the way back to Son House and the Mississippi bluegrass atonal singer on his stoop, just him against the world, let it out. And that's the heart of music. And really, just like you mentioned, the heart of storytelling. The Talking Heads album, Speaking in Tongues, that is one of the most amazing arrangements of songs. It's like a novel, a sonic novel that plays itself out, starting with Burning Down the House, which is almost this Nietzschean reevaluation of life, right? All the way to the melodic celebratory end. It's just a masterpiece of laying it out in a way that is responding to not infinite opportunity, but excruciating limitation. And when you're up against the wall, constraints engender creativity. No pain, no gain, no risk, no reward. And if you're feeling the agony of human existence, then you are bequeathed the privilege of the ecstasy of creative expression. And I think more than anything else, the music that we love really embodies that flavor of limit, tapping into the limitlessness of the human soul and doing it in a way that's genuine, that's honest, that's coming from the heart. Again, to your point, we're doing it because we love to do it. Rick Rubin has been doing his tour and he pops up on Instagram memes, and even though he looks like a old Jedi Knight with the beard and the hair, he's become kind of a cliche of himself. But the shit that he says is absolutely true. Screw the audience. It's not about the audience, and he doesn't mean it in a contemptuous way. Obviously, it's for people to love and enjoy and engage with. But as far as a creative person goes, do what you feel is right and do it a lot and do it to your own satisfaction and let it loose. And if that's your own and it's the only criteria for doing what you do and how you do it, then whether or not you're on that Billboard top 40 or whether you're an obscure punk band playing in a cellar, that's what the creative process is all about. Be true to yourself. And as a fan and as a listener, you do it from the passion of your heart. You know, you put together that taxonomy map of all the bands coming from King Crimson, not because someone asked you to do it or you want to put it on social media for the most likes, it's because straight from the heart. You are so into this that you're going to map this shit out. That is awesome. And that really is why we've loved this stuff. We continue to talk about it. And probably the final stroke of this whole thing is it just brings so much joy. And if we could just share it with our kids to get even an iota of this bliss that we had going all the way back to those first records and record stores and needles on vinyl and getting too drunk at an underage show and getting dumped by our girlfriends after the show and being stranded in a bad neighborhood and catching a glimpse of your favorite superstar right outside the coach bus. That's great shit. That's the stuff that really makes life worth living.
Yeah. I mean, I can remember, when my kids were younger, and they would hear, some of the music, that I would be playing. My son, when he was in the second grade, actually sang a Rush tune a cappella for his second grade talent show. It was a song off of their last studio album, Clockwork Angels, a tune called "The Wreckers," and he just nailed it. And he had all the inflection there, and he sang it a cappella. So I'm standing in the audience, and I actually made him wear my 1980s Permanent Waves tour shirt that I got at the concert to go up on that stage and sing the wreckers. And boy, no one in the crowd knew it, but he really nailed it. And
Yeah,
so I,
I love
you know,
that song. That's a
yeah,
great song, and tears are coming to my eyes just hearing your story about your son singing that. And similarly, my son couple years ago had a high school essay that he was writing, and he had to talk to one of his parents about something that they were passionate about and share that with the class. So I go, Nick, my very favorite song in the whole world is from the Finnish death metal band Children of Bodom, and that's a whole separate thing that you and I can talk about, these other genres and how I'm into Scandinavian death
yeah,
metal and black metal now. But anyway, Children of Bodom have a song called Every Time I Die. And to me, it's one of the greatest songs ever recorded. I'll put it in the liner notes here along with yours. And I told him why I loved it. I played him the song, and it sounds like heavy Metallica guitars with double bass drums going nuts. It's got a keyboard in it, and the vocalist sounds like Cookie Monster. And he was like, "What the hell is this?" But he saw my passion, and I showed him the lyrics. To your point, I had to dig around for the lyrics because I didn't have the album. I had the streamed song. And he got into me getting into this weird Finnish death metal music. And we had an amazing father son moment. Does he love the band? No. Was he into the song? Well, what the hell is this? But he saw that dad was passionate about something. And I honestly feel that my passion translated into his passion, liking and exploring his own music. And that's a gift that we can share with our children, and hopefully our kids can keep that tradition alive in terms of sharing the enthusiasm that you and I have talked about over the last, wow, we've been going for an hour and a half, Kevin. So that's not surprising. I think we can go for another few hours just relating stories of shows and our enthusiasm. But I really want to thank you for spending time to share your fanatical fandom with me and with our listeners. And I'd love for you to come back maybe in a little while, and we could keep the conversation going, and you could share some of your more recent experiences out there seeing some of the old guys jam like never before.
yeah. We could. I really thank you for lighting that pilot light in me. It's like I said, it's always been there, and it's one of those things that defines me as a person, the music. And it's like I said in the beginning, it's always been there, it will always be there. And it's sort of that common thread that, when I get the opportunity to just espouse on music, and that experience in growing up, it's just something like you said, and people see that in me. I've been told that before. Like, you just light up when somebody mentions music, and you just go. and
Yeah.
and it's one of those things that we could probably get into the concert experience or things like that. There are a lot of shows coming up that I'm going to go see. I could report on those experiences. But it's been a pleasure talking with you, and kind of sharing you know these moments of my life that I think are somewhat relatable to people, and help to influence others and expose people to the music that we love, because that music will never ever ever go away. It's too creative, it's too impactful, and it's too meaningful, to us as people. It actually shaped us as individuals and defined who we are as people. As we progress through adolescence and you're trying to find your way, some of those lyrics kind of gave you an answer, or steered you in a direction that you could follow your heart with. And that's something that I mean, to me, like, you can't ask for any more, like, out of any sort of experience. And music really is the pinnacle of all experiences, in my opinion.
To be continued. Thanks again. Kevin. We will pick this up again in a few months. You can report back. And thanks, listeners, to the No Hair, All Heart podcast series. As you can tell, I still have no hair, and Kevin has got more heart than we can pack into 90 minutes. So to be continued. Thanks, Kevin. We'll be in
Great.
touch.
Thanks. Bye bye.